Hello everyone! In today's video we are painting a very easy step-by-step sunset watercolor painting. This is a painting that really everyone can join into. You don't need any experience to paint this watercolor painting with me. The materials I'm using today are gouache paint. Gouache is a chalk-based watercolor paint that is perfect for layering vibrant colors, so perfect for this sunset picture. The picture on screen now is our reference picture, and it really is an easy painting to paint for beginners. I am layering my gouache colors on my palette, and I've picked these warm reds and oranges and purples that I see in this photo. You can see I'm keeping it quite simple. I'm not making a sketch today, and I'm applying my paint straight to the dry paper. I'm not too worried about the edges. I'm going to keep this a little bit loose and just see how the edges turn out if I leave them be. So you can see here, my paint is a little bit too dry. I almost dipped my brush in my tea. Never do that. It happened so many times though. But I am adding a little bit more water to my paint and just starting with the first layer. When you switch up your colors, make sure you clean your brush really well. And you can definitely join this class by using watercolors as well. I am using gouache today because I really like the vibrancy of the colors, but you can definitely also use watercolor paint. The second layer I'm adding is that dark purple. So I make sure that I spread it out to my palette a little bit. I'm using a very large flat brush today, and it's lovely for this background. To make sure that it mixes up a little bit with the blue, I make sure that I add some water to my paint. The more water you use, the easier your colors mix up and the looser your painting is going to be. And that is very similar with watercolor as well as with gouache. So you can see I'm mixing up my colors a little bit. I'll make sure I go over that blue a bit extra to make sure that the colors are mixed up. My paper is very thick. I'm using a 300 GSM thickness watercolor paper. So I can use quite a lot of water and mix on my paper itself. The thicker your paper is, the more water it can hold. It doesn't necessarily mean better quality, but often it does. Usually better quality papers are a little bit thicker. So I'm swapping to this lighter pink color. It's like a pinkish purple color, very bright. And adding the next layer. I do not mind seeing my brush strokes in the paint. It doesn't have to be super even for me. I quite like a bit of texture there. But the bigger the brushes that you use and the more consistent your strokes are, like if you add lots of small strokes, you get lots of texture, and if you add long, smooth strokes, your paint will be more even and smooth. On the edges I make it a little bit rough on purpose, so I make sure with a dry brush I spread up my paint a little bit to really make it look like the edges have that sort of paint effect. You know, when you paint a fence and you have some strokes that are a bit dry, like that. So spreading out the colors towards the bottom, a little bit more of this warm orangey red and some of my really vibrant darker red. This dark red is almost pink. It has a very intense color. It's called primary red, but I think it's a little bit towards the pink. So maybe a little bit more. And this is something that you could do with all sorts of mediums. If you wanted to make a sunset color in pastels or with oil paints or with acrylic paint, you could really approach this in the same way. My medium of choice today is gouache, but you could paint this with any type of paint that you have. The look might be a little bit different, but the principle is the same. And what I love about paintings like this is that you don't need to be good at drawing in order to make a fun painting like this. Sometimes people think that to be creative means that you need to be good at sketching or good at drawing realistic drawings, but actually there's so much more to creativity than being able to draw realistically. The paint is drying slightly, and it's not completely dry yet, but it's dry enough to start adding in my white clouds. So I've mixed up a little bit of white gouache, watered it down just a tiny bit, and I'm going to use that white to add in some clouds in my sky. So there we go. This is the first cloud shape. If your paint is still really wet, then wait for a moment, because you want it to be at least dry to the touch. I do not mind if my white mixes up with my colors a little bit, but I want it to look at least like a light color, white or cream. If your paint underneath is still really white, it's really hard to get that white color effect. And this is a good rule for gouache in general. Always make sure your layers are dry before you add another layer over it. So you can see with a clean dry brush, I'm just spreading that paint out a little bit towards the bottom. There we go, just a random cloud shape. I'm not looking at the reference photo at all. I'm just making it up as I see fit and the way that I find it fun. That reference photo was there for my initial inspiration, and now I'm just adding clouds the way I feel that, makes me happy. I have an entire class that you can watch on painting clouds. I'll put a link in the description. It's free for you to watch. So I'll make sure that I share that as well. It is part of my painting landscapes in your own style course. But the first lesson, the clouds painting lesson, is completely free for you to join. So there we go. I'm quite happy with these. It's okay if they're a little bit translucent, so I'm adding a little bit of water to show these pink colors underneath. And I'm going to let that dry for a moment. Now it's really important to let your layers dry, because we're going to go over it with a dark color. You can use a really dark blue or a black, and we do not want those dark colors to bleed out in the colors underneath. So make sure you let your painting dry, even if it means leaving it alone for a little while. Go make a cup of tea or use a hairdryer to dry it a little bit faster. And when it's completely dry, you come back, grab yourself some black paint or some dark blue, and we are going to add some details that really bring the painting together. So you can see I'm using black here, and I've also swapped to a smaller brush, and I'm still using a flat brush, but you can definitely do this with a round brush as well. I want this beginner's painting class to be as easily accessible as possible. Anyone should be able to join in, so even if you don't have the exact materials that I have, just use the materials that you have and see how you get on. I'm sure you can still make a beautiful painting. So this is where my horizon line is going to be. And you can see that with sort of left to right zigzag moves, I start to add a little bit of these waves in the water. Water always has so many reflections on it, but because of that it also has lots of shadows. Sometimes we forget about the shadows. And that's what we're adding in now. The light areas, or the colorful areas that we keep open, are basically the reflections, the reflection of the sky in this case, of the sunset, and the darker areas are the shadow sides of each of these waves. And when you create these sort of shapes, you can really experiment a little bit, just try it out. Usually when you put your brush in the paint, you get a very dark color, and the longer you use it, the lighter your color is going to get. So you can see my colors are getting lighter here towards the foreground, some softer shades, and I'm going in there to make them a bit darker again here and there. But I like to use my brush until I run out of paint, just to see what variety in colors I get by doing nothing, by just finishing the paint on my brush. I'm really taking my time for this. This is supposed to be a relaxing activity, so take a deep breath, take a little break sometimes, roll your shoulder, make sure you sit up straight, and take your time. There's no rush. So for me, because I'm using this flat brush, these shapes are quite easy to create. You can see I've mixed up a little bit of the white paint that was still on my palette with my black, so I'm creating some grey colors as well. But if you use a round brush, you can also create fine lines. It's just a little bit easier with a flat brush, because you already naturally get those stripes, those flat stripes. So I'm going to do this all the way to the edge, over the entire painting. And I feel that it starts to look a little bit like water already. I feel I need a bit more in the picture to bring it really together, but already starts to feel at least a little bit like a seaside or a tropical island. So there we go. I had a little sneak peek at our reference photo, and there was these palm trees leaning over from the left hand side. So I'm starting to add in a bit of the silhouette of an island, or maybe there's some plants here. This doesn't have to be perfect, it's all about just creating atmosphere and creating suggestions of shape. And this is going to be my first palm tree. So when you're ready, decide where your tree is going to be. You can look at my picture first, see how I do it. But when you're ready, decide where the picture is going to be, where the line is going to be. And don't hesitate, once you're ready, just put it on the paper. So, see, no sketch necessary. Just take a breath, and once you're ready, put that line down. You don't want to tinker with it too much, because although you can take your paint off the paper, you can always make it wet and then use some tissue paper to lift it off. It doesn't work very well. It's just much better to leave it, do it in one stroke and then leave it and not tinker with it too much. So this is my first palm tree and a bit of a reflection underneath in grey. And then a palm tree has these leaves that waver out from the middle, almost like a star. So you can see I'm being quite careful here. And I'm starting to add some of those big palm leaves in front of the cloud and over the sky. So I can't say this enough, make sure that your layers underneath are completely dry. If that cloud is still a little bit wet, it might mix up with this black paint and create like a shape, like a blurred out shape. And we want these lines to be fairly precise, at least not blurred out. I'm sharing some other classes on this channel where I'm showing you how to paint wet on wet, and that's the opposite of what we're doing today. When it comes to these palm trees, you can add as many or as few as you like. You can keep it very minimal and just add a few leaves and only one palm tree, or you can make a whole forest and add loads. It's completely up to you. I love silhouette paintings. It's such a fun way of instantly making this colorful background look like a landscape. So there we go. I am adding in the second tree. As I said, don't hesitate. Once you decide where it's going to be determined with your stroke. You want it to be fairly straight, or at least feel like a determined line. So take a moment to visualize where it's going to go, and once you're ready, just put that black line on the paper and don't worry about it too much. As soon as you start overthinking it, it becomes more and more difficult. The worst thing that can happen is that you ruin this little painting. That's okay. You don't want to know how many paintings I have ruined in my life, and I still much rather create some mistakes than not create at all. I want this bush, these plants in the foreground a little bit darker. There we go. And I still feel like I'm missing something, so maybe I'll just add in some large leaves here on the left hand side that suggest that there's another larger tree just out of view. Maybe it's a bit more in the foreground, or maybe it's just a larger tree next to the other ones. I feel it puts everything a little bit more in perspective. So I'll make sure that the leaves on these branches are even a bit bigger. There we go. Just one more. As I said, each of these components is optional. You can add as many or as few trees as you want. You know what? I'm going to add a few birds in the sky. Really simple. Make sure I don't have too much paint on my brush. The nice sharp tip of my brush. Adding some V shapes. There we go. I'm now thinking that maybe I want some white reflections in the water, just to create a little bit of extra contrast and depth. So let me grab a little bit more white paint. So just mixing it on my palette. And just here and there adding some highlights to the picture. And the lovely thing about painting in gouache is that you can use lighter paint on top of darker paint. And usually it's very opaque. It depends a bit on the brand and the type of paint that you buy. You can check the opacity on the outside of the tube. Usually it's very opaque and you can really add highlights back in later on. This is something that is much harder to do with traditional watercolor paint. Not impossible, but much harder to do. I always recommend people who are new to watercolor painting to keep a tube of white gouache at hand. It's such a lovely tool to add some highlights. You can mix it with your watercolor paint to create a gouache type, like lighter color that is very opaque, and it's a lot of fun to do. So you don't need to buy lots of gouache, just one tube of white gouache is enough to to add these highlights into your paintings. Just adding some finishing touches here and there. Some slightly darker clouds. I'm using a very watery dark purple here to just add a little bit more detail in the background. All of this is me just tinkering onto my painting. You can decide it's finished at any point, but I like to just take it to the next level and give it just that extra little bit of detail. Often clouds are a bit darker on the bottom and lighter at the top. So you could add a little bit of that watery purple to your clouds as well. There you go. I am finished. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel. I have weekly art videos and I teach you how to paint with watercolors, gouache, how to draw with color pencils, and I share lots of other art inspiration as well. So this was my painting for today. Thank you so much for joining in and I hope to see you soon.